Okay. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar. Today we're going to be talking about Scope 3 emissions, and this is the second part of a two-part series. Today we're really going to be discussing getting suppliers on board. And so in case you guys didn't know who we are SINAI Technologies and the planet's leading decarbonization intelligence platform. We have software that is built to measure, analyze, price, and reduce emissions. And speaking today, my name is Alicia Giglio, and I'm a climate change expert at SINAI Technologies. With me today, I also have Kaio, who's also a climate change expert at SINAI Technologies. And Ariel is helping facilitate this webinar. And so today, as we get kicked off, we're first going to be talking about Scope 3 management overview. We'll then get into different challenges and solutions for accurate Scope 3 measurements. And then finally, we're going to bring in the decarbonization piece and discuss how to think about decarbonizing your Scope 3 emissions inventory. Finally, we'll have some time at the end for a question and answer. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kaio to kick us off.
Thanks, Alicia. So I will kick off the presentation by first describing what are and the importance of the Scope 3 emissions. For those of you who are new to the GHG space, Scope 2 emissions are direct emissions from owned or controlled resources by a reporting company. So for example, natural gas that is combusted in a processing plant or even in a furnace, it's considered part of the Scope 1 emissions from our company. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from the generation of purchased or acquired electricity or utilities such as steam, heat, or cooling. You're still responsible for these sources, however, have a smaller control on how the electricity is generated. Scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions not included in Scope 2 that occur in the value chain of the reporting company. These emissions are both upstream, which is usually driven by suppliers, or downstream, which is usually driven by consumers. So these are basically the Scope 3 emission sources. In recent years, many regulations and reporting frameworks are requiring robust Scope 3 disclosures. According to SBTi, if a company has significant Scope 3 emissions, it should set a Scope 3 target. Significant Scope 3 emissions are defined by the SBTi, that are an organization that has Scope 3 emissions which represent more than 40% of total Scope 1 and 2, 3. However, Scope 3 targets doesn't need to be the same as Scope 1 and 2. The SBTi requires that a target is set of a minimum of 67% of Scope 3 emissions, which means that you could potentially leave some of your emissions out of your target. And although the science-based target requirement of Scope 3 targets are not as stringent, a Scope 3 target should be ambitious, measurable, and clearly demonstrate how a company is addressing the main sources of value chain GHG emissions in line with current practice. In addition to SBTi, the SEC from US is proposing a rule where they would require Scope 3 disclosures if they are material or if the filler has a target. Under this reporting framework, emissions reporting would need to be in absolute terms and also in terms of intensity. Also, the TCFD and the CDP are also working to harmonize recommendations around more robust Scope 3 disclosures. And a general approach in line with the GHG Protocol recommendation is a 6-step approach to assist organizations in building the easiest and most accurate Scope 3 inventory. In the first step, we can walk through defining the Scope 3 boundary in order to identify what categories can be applied to their business. As a second step, we identify business goals like an SBTi target or any target connected to green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, stakeholder commitment, and etc. that could influence the company define its mitigation strategies. Once we have established the boundaries of our Scope 3 calculations, we identify relevant activities by performing materiality and relevance assessment. This assessment will support us in the step 4 and 5, which are completely concurrently. Generally, us and our clients have an idea of the calculation methodology we'd like to use in the Scope 3 calculation. However, sometimes while attempting to search for an average data, we may come across a situation where only space-based data is available. In those instances, we can always work with the client to use different methodologies where the data forces us to. And as a final step of this iteration is to make the data quality assessment in order to improve the Scope 3 inventory over time. And in this step, we can identify relevant suppliers to improve data collection and get more precise data from them. And once the relevant and the priority of Scope 3 categories has been defined, the appropriate calculation methodology for the category must be determined. There are many different calculation methodologies for each category, but generally, calculation methodologies are either spend-based, average, or mass-based data, or supplier-specific. Spend-based methodologies use financial spend data in general industry average emission factors per unit spend. Due to ever-changing global economics, this calculation methodology is the least accurate. It's usually applied for the first time Scope 3 screening or when there is an unmanageable number of suppliers. Average data or mass data calculation methodologies use actual consumption data. It can be in volume or mass, and also in combination of industry average emission factors per unit consumed. This type of calculation is significantly more accurate than spend-based methodologies, but it still may not accurately reflecting the emissions from your value chain. Mainly if an industry or global average emission factors vary significantly from your operations or even because of time. However, this is the most used category, and it's mostly for top emission categories where consumption data is easily trackable. A combination of two methods can also be used, which is considered a hybrid method. In that case, we've seen customers using this approach, prioritizing collecting data from the most relevant suppliers and filling the gap with less precise method for emissions less representative for the Scope 3 category. This is the starting point for defining better mitigation strategies once you already mapped your hotspots and can start using more precise data to identify mitigation opportunities. The last and the most accurate calculation methodology is to use only supply-specific data. In this calculation, actual consumption data, similar to the average data method, is used. However, supplier or customer-specific emission factors relevant to upstream and downstream activities are used. By using these emission factors, you can be certain that you are calculating your Scope 3 emissions to the utmost accuracy. That's the best approach if you want to develop carbon neutral or net zero product. Now that you know about more the calculation methodologies in Scope 3 categories in general, I can hand over to Alicia, who's going to talk more about how we are supporting our clients with their Scope 3 inventory.
Great, thanks, Kyle. And so I'll show you how we put this Scope 3 calculation into practice when we worked on one global manufacturing client on their first time Scope 3 GHG inventory. And since this client was starting from scratch, what we did as an initial step was to perform a Scope 3 inventory relevance and materiality assessment, which really considered the operation's business goals in order to define which of the Scope 3 categories to prioritize for data collection. And as I'm sure most of you know, there are 15 Scope 3 categories. And so for this particular client, what we first found in that initial pass was that 11 of the categories were determined to be relevant, And then 6 of these 11 categories were determined to have a high or medium impact on their scope 3 inventory and their net emissions. So these six categories were really prioritized for data collection. And so you can envision, because this was a manufacturing client, basically what they owned was the manufacturing or the production portion of their value chain. And so mainly the high emitting categories were that like material sourcing piece, which were upstream categories in the categories such as category 1, which is purchased goods and services, upstream fuel and energy, and upstream transportation and waste. And so the data collection for this 6 categories took approximately 4 months for basically the business to identify the correct people in order to gather all the relevant information that we needed across all their facilities. And so this did take a while because it was their first scope 3 inventory. We were working for a large company that had more than 10 facilities. And so you can envision that, this data set everywhere at the moment or when we were collecting it, there wasn't a good process for this. So we had to reach out to everybody in order to identify the source of the information. Another reason why it kind of took that longer time was because our client was interested in using the average data methodologies for most of their categories, particularly the high and medium influence ones. So instead of just, obtaining procurement records or spend-based data, for many instances, we actually had to reach out to our plant operators or people on site for details of the actual, consumption and inventories of their purchased goods and services. And so using this detailed plant information, once it was collected, SINAI basically worked with the client to help identify all the relevant emission factors for their data, particularly in category 1, in order to calculate their emissions using those average data methods. And so now we're complete. We finished those primary scope 3 categories, those top 6, but our work isn't done. So in the future, what we're planning on doing is working with a client in order to reduce the amount of time for this annual data collection. What we really want to do is improve their internal processes and really automate the data into the software. And then eventually what we also want to do is expand our scope 3 calculations to include all of our relevant scope 3 categories, even if that means we're just going to be using, spend-based methodologies at the moment where it might be difficult to find that data. Finally, as a last step, what we also want to do is use this initial inventory as a starting point to identifying, the main contributors or hotspots in the value chain, to then begin engaging with those suppliers and migrating towards using supplier-specific data. So obviously we want to facilitate those efforts in those high influence categories. And so that's where we would start with that supplier engagement. And as we get into the next section, really setting up our detailed scope 3 inventory as a first pass is the initial step for that supplier engagement. And so with that, we're going to talk about the supplier engagement piece. And really the challenges and solutions towards moving towards more accurate scope 3 measurements. And so we can take us to the next slide. So when you're kicking off your supplier engagement, what you envision is your organization has probably already performed an initial scope 3 assessment. You've probably already identified the hotspots in your scope 3 inventory, as well as your value chain. But now you're ready to kick off the supplier engagement and, where do you start and what do you do? So at SINAI, we've developed 4 steps to really getting started on the supplier engagement piece. The first step is, internal alignment with your business as well as key stakeholders or teams in order to ensure that everyone agrees with really the profile of suppliers to prioritize your engagement with. The second is that you need to prepare your suppliers. And so we know that scope 3 calculations and value chain connections are going to be very, very tough on everybody. And so giving everybody a heads up that this is coming is really going to be critical for your success throughout this engagement. Now, finally, in our third step, we're ready to collect our data. So this is when you're actually sending out those requests and analyzing all your results internally. Now, finally, the whole point of engaging with your value chain to improve your calculations is to eventually make measurable emissions reductions impacts. And so to collectively do this, you must share your results and continue to iterate on the challenges in order to make changes for the future. And so these 4 steps are really structured to first help you be successful, and second, really optimize your precious time and internal resources. And so as we dig into our first step, this was our internal alignment step. Really, the goal here is to be sure that your engagement efforts are structured to reach all your suppliers, whilst also prioritizing your precious internal resources on suppliers that are definitely material to your scope 3 inventory and have an impact on your value chain. And so some of the challenges that we're seeing with obtaining this internal alignment are first, different verticals of your business could have different business priorities. You guys could be working towards different goals, such as maybe your sustainability team wants to engage with suppliers with the largest emissions contribution, and procurement teams with the largest financial impact. These might not always be the same suppliers. And so to really overcome all these different priorities, what we recommend at SINAI is to introduce a low carbon governance within your organization, if you haven't done this already. And so this is going to be really, really important as you get really into detailed scope 3 inventories, because you want to align all your internal incentives and empower your organization to reduce the number of interfaces between all your functions involved in this type of work. Furthermore, you also want to lean on sector-specific recommendations throughout this process for really best practices on how to approach those business priorities and engagements. Now, the second challenge is going to be data management. And so all the data that we're collecting throughout this process is only going to be as good as those internal systems that you're leveraging in order to house this data and turn your insights into action. Now, to ensure that you're really getting the most out of your engagement with suppliers, you want to be sure that you're developing a plan before you get started in order to determine what those key insights that you need to gain, and what goals that you really need to meet throughout this process. And finally, I'm sure you're aware you're going to be managing tons of data. And so we recommend that, utilizing software in order to assist in this data gathering, processing processes, and really establishing a repeatable process is definitely going to be recommended. And so our second step is really preparing and aligning your suppliers. And so the main goal of this step is to first ensure that you're reaching out to the right suppliers. And then second, you really want to make sure that your efforts are not lost on those who don't know how to respond. So throughout this preparation and alignment step, really some of the challenges that we've identified is some of your suppliers may have immature carbon accounting practices. So this could be in many forms. Maybe they've never quantified their scope 1 or 2 emissions. Maybe they haven't gotten as far to have things like a product carbon intensity to provide to you. And then we've also found that maybe some suppliers in particular regions may be more forward or advanced at sharing that data, compared to others where those practices aren't yet established in, say, those industries or regions. And so a solution to really overcoming the differences in this space is to really kick off your engagement with suppliers in a region, in an industry, where they have an incentive or market pressure to respond. Furthermore, because you might have to reach out, to some suppliers that don't have these calculations internally, what you want to do to help these particular suppliers is you want to offer support to these types of companies. Early in the engagement, you want to communicate what is expected from your suppliers and then provide any available resources that you might have on GHG inventory building, as well as developing those product carbon intensities. Now, our second challenge is data privacy. And I think this really is just as relevant as our first challenge. So Kaio is going to talk to this a little bit later, but we found that many suppliers are going to be uncomfortable with sharing this type of information as they don't know what it may mean to their business. We did have the opportunity to work on a value chain engagement project, and we worked with 6 different members and found that each member or company had their individual data privacy concerns. And you can envision that this obviously significantly increased the time to get work done, as well as put some roadblocks throughout our processes. So when notifying your suppliers that you're going to start this process, in that initial outreach, make sure that you're spelling out your data usage and privacy conditions, and really listen to any concerns that your suppliers might have. Now, our third challenge is governance. And so supply chain changes will really be successful only to the extent that they are supported by clear targets, dedicated funding, and management incentives. So really be sure to begin your engagement with a group of suppliers that you have more control or buy-in to ensure the successful collaboration. So our third step is actually gathering the data from your suppliers. And so throughout our third step, this is really where we're measuring our emissions from our suppliers and quantifying their impact on our scope 3. There's numerous different challenges that we've ran into. And so one of the big ones here is differing calculation methodologies. And so presume that we've identified some organizations that have calculated their emissions. What we found is that there's obviously many different approaches to calculating your emissions. If you don't ask the right questions, it might be really impossible to understand the data you receive, under which protocol they're using, under which calculation methodologies they're using, or which emission factors they're using. And what you're trying to do is develop a scope 3 inventory that is aligned across all your suppliers, and you want to be able to have valuable insights. So it's very important that there is an alignment between all the data that you're collecting. And so some solutions to this challenge would be maybe creating your own questionnaire to gather all the data, as well as that additional information that you might need throughout this process. But obviously you need to recognize, your own internal resources that are available, as you might have to handhold some of your suppliers throughout this process. And that's really why on the previous step, we recommend only reaching out to those subset of suppliers that are really going to make a measurable impact. You also want to make sure that it's really as easy as possible for these suppliers to respond. And if you're unsure about the ability to compile this in-house information, you may want to ask for, energy data instead of emissions data, which can be used to calculate an emissions intensity, just to make sure that all your suppliers are aligned in the data that you're gathering from them. Our second challenge when you're actually, measuring this data is that data management. And so some suppliers you might get pointing you in the direction of publicly available information. They might send you to outdated product carbon intensities or environmental product declarations. And in many cases, these might not have the right context for your calculations. So we want to try to avoid using a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think this can definitely be improved by developing your own questionnaires and making sure you're calculating and capturing the correct data. And so finally, in our last step, once we have a baseline of your performance, this final step, so our step 4, is to share those results back with your suppliers. Ariel, if you can take us to the next slide. And so what we want to do throughout this step is to identify any barriers that your suppliers face to reduce your emissions and co-create a plan for improvement. So for instance, our key goal here is to reduce our emissions. And maybe one thing that you can do with your suppliers is create a plan for them using renewable energy over the next 5 to 10 years. Now, a main challenge with these next steps and decarbonization piece is a level of participation. You might get insufficient feedback or buy-in from some of your suppliers, and they might be slow at turning some of these insights into action. And so really to overcome this, collaboration is going to be key. So we want to establish that this process of collecting emissions and improving on our emissions profile is going to be completed annually as part of your supplier buyer framework. And you want to share your incentives with your clients in order to make sure that they're really responding to you annually. So you can share incentives like, decarbonization opportunities for their operations, or maybe different funding mechanisms that you could use in order to support them. And so with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kaio, who's going to be discussing a real world example of a supplier engagement that we worked on recently.
Thanks, Alicia. So, as you know, we went through scope three categories, how to engage with your suppliers. So now that you have a complete understanding of scope 3 emissions, it's time to start defining mitigation pathways. But as it's hard to develop a scope 3 inventory, or define mitigation strategies within your value chain can be even harder. So as an example, we did a proof of concept with the agriculture sector, where there were companies part of the same value chain, but completely different goals and GHG accounting practices. The ultimate goal of this project was to be able to share primary data across the value chain and also identify decarbonization opportunities that could benefit all stakeholders towards to a net zero value chain. But it was very challenging to align everyone's business objective in order to achieve the ultimate goal of this project. And as Alicia said, they were very concerned about their data privacy and how these would be shared across the value chain. Also, since all these companies had multiple products, they were not prepared to share primary data by allocating their emissions at the product level. And then we supported by standardized and allocation methodologies where all companies could be aligned, respecting, of course, all known international standards. So at SINAI, we calculate product emissions intensity by using your GHG inventory, and then we allocate emissions to each product. The idea is to be able to develop a corporate inventory, but at the same time, we can allocate appropriately your emissions to your products, avoiding missing any auxiliary emission sources that are not directly connected to the product, and also to be able to update those values on a frequent basis. And after you have your emissions allocated, it's possible to connect with your suppliers or even with your buyers and share emissions from a specific product, keeping also your data privacy, since you're not disclosing it publicly. And although being transparent in scope 3 disclosure is very important, keeping data privacy can enable the company to share emissions data from specific facilities or products or and even to specific actors, which is crucial to meet decarbonization goals. And one of the reasons that calculating scope 3 emissions using primary data besides accuracy is that the secondary data is not usually updated frequently. So there are a lot of emission factors that are actually out to date. So at SINAI, product intensity values can be calculated on a yearly basis, which can also demonstrate commitment from suppliers that are reducing their emissions over time. In a buyer perspective, having this kind of information can support supplier assessment and also performance tracking. Based on this pilot project, that we found that secondary data, for example, those coming from LC databases, could be up to 100% higher compared to primary data. We are going to release our deep findings on this pilot project soon, and we'll be sure that we are going to share the report with the webinar participants. Then, after you have like this engagement, and if you're looking to decarbonize your value chain, it is very important to share your goals with them. Also, your goals, we also depend, we also help them decarbonize their own supply chains. And there are many strategies that you can work along your suppliers to help them decarbonize, such as provide legal support for retailers to contract renewable energy, shift to more efficient modes of transport, or identify energy efficient opportunities like retrofitting HVAC system or upgrade equipments, or even circular economy practices that could be a win-win situation. However, mitigation strategies will also depend on the category and the level of accuracy of your Scope 3 emissions measuring practices. So this is why it's very important to get primary data so you can have a wide range of opportunities to decarbonize your own value chain. So based on this, wrapping up for today, what we learned for today, we went to the Scope 3 basics. We understand what are the Scope 3 categories and what are the way that we can measure your Scope 3 emissions. We also identify challenges and potential solutions to get a more accurate Scope 3 emissions inventory by walking you through like a 4-step approach to kicking off and improving your supplier engagement over time. And also we discuss about potential Scope 3 strategies to mitigate your emissions in your value chain. So considering this now, I hand it over back to Ariel, who's going to lead the Q&A session. Ariel?